11 days after we buried my son, I came home from the grocery store to find 4 cardboard boxes sitting on the porch of the house I had lived in for 6 years. My clothes. My photographs. My mother's china, wrapped in newspaper someone hadn't bothered to be careful with, because one of the teacups was already cracked down the side. I remember the exact weather that afternoon, a thin, gray drizzle that hadn't quite committed to becoming real rain, the kind of sky James used to call undecided when he was a boy, standing at the window trying to guess whether he'd need his raincoat for school. I had been at the grocery store buying ingredients for a pot roast, something ordinary, something that felt like the first normal thing I'd tried to do since the funeral, and I remember thinking, pulling into the driveway with the bag still in the passenger seat, that the boxes on the porch looked wrong before I even understood why. Too neat. Too deliberate. Not the kind of thing that happens by accident. Kimberly was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, wearing one of James's old flannel shirts like a costume of grief she'd put on for the occasion. Her eyes were dry. "Margaret," she said, using my first name the way she only ever did when she wanted me to feel like a stranger in my own family, "I think it's time you found your own place. This has all been a lot, and I need space to grieve without this arrangement complicating things." I stood on the front walk with my car keys still in my hand, looking at 4 boxes that represented the sum total of what I was apparently allowed to keep of the life I'd built in that house, the house I had helped my son and his wife buy, the house where I'd moved into the converted garage apartment after my own home sold, the house where, 11 days earlier, I had watched my only child's casket lowered into the ground while this same woman had held my arm and told me we'd get through this together. "Kimberly," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, "James wanted me here. We talked about this arrangement together, the 3 of us, when you first bought the place." "James isn't here anymore," she said, and something in the flatness of her voice told me this conversation had already been decided long before I pulled into the driveway. "I have to think about what's best for me now." I asked her, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be in that moment, whether I could at least come inside and gather anything she might have missed, a request that felt absurd even as I made it, asking permission to enter a home I had helped pay for. She shook her head. "I already packed everything that seemed important. I don't think it's a good idea for you to be in there right now, Margaret. It's not good for either of us." I didn't argue. I didn't cry, not there on that porch with the neighbor's curtains twitching. I picked up the first box, feeling the cracked teacup shift inside the newspaper, and I carried it to my car. If a moment like that has ever happened to you, grief and betrayal arriving in the same week, from someone who was supposed to be family, drop the city you're watching from in the comments. And if this story pulls you the way it pulled me through living it, hit like. It helps stories like mine find the people who need them. What Kimberly didn't know, standing in that doorway with her arms crossed, was that eviction would turn out to be the single biggest mistake of her life. Let me take you back to where this all began. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 69 years old, and for most of my life, my whole world orbited around one person, my son, James. His father left when James was 4, and I raised him alone in a small rented house 2 towns over from where we ended up, working double shifts as a hospital administrator, saving every spare dollar I could into an account I never touched no matter how tight things got, because I had one goal, that my son would never inherit the kind of financial fear I'd grown up with. James grew into a quiet, careful man, an engineer who designed water treatment systems for municipalities across 3 states, steady and unglamorous work that nonetheless paid well and let him build something solid for himself. I used to tease him, gently, that he'd inherited his father's restlessness but channeled it into pipes and pressure valves instead of running off somewhere new every few years. He'd laugh and say, "Someone in this family had to build something that stays put, Mom." He meant it as a joke, but I think, looking back now, he meant it as a promise too, a quiet vow to be the kind of steady presence his own father had never managed to be for either of us. He met Kimberly at 29, at a coworker's wedding, and I remember watching them dance that night thinking he'd finally found someone who matched his gentleness. She'd worn a green dress that night, I remember, and laughed at something he whispered to her with her whole body, the way you laugh when you're not yet guarding anything. I drove home that evening feeling, for the first time in years, like I could finally stop worrying quite so much about whether my son would ever let himself be happy. I was wrong about that being the whole story, though it would take me years and a funeral to understand exactly how wrong. When James and Kimberly decided to buy their first real home together, 8 years ago, they were short on the down payment by a significant amount. I had, by then, sold my own small house after my husband, James's stepfather, a good man named Robert who'd come into our lives when James was 16, passed away from lung cancer. I had nearly $200,000 sitting in an account, money I'd always privately thought of as James's eventual inheritance, money that had taken me 3 decades of careful, unglamorous saving to build. I gave James and Kimberly $140,000 toward the down payment on the house on Birchwood Lane. I didn't do it as a loan. I did it because that's what mothers who love their children do, and because James, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with tears in his eyes, had promised me something in return that I never once doubted. "Mom," he'd said, "there's always going to be a place for you here. Always. I'm going to make sure of it, on paper, so nobody can ever question it." 2 years later, when they finished converting the detached garage into a small one-bedroom apartment, James asked me to move in. He told me, more than once, that he'd had his attorney draft language into his will and into a trust document, granting me what the lawyer called a life estate in that portion of the property, meaning, in plain terms, that no matter what happened to him, I would always have the legal right to live there for the rest of my life, regardless of who owned the main house. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters for everything that comes after. Kimberly and I were never close in the way mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law sometimes are in movies. She was polished, ambitious, always immaculately put together, and I was a retired hospital administrator who preferred gardening to galas. But we were civil. Cordial, even, most days. I told myself the coolness between us was simply a difference in temperament, nothing more. I had no reason, back then, to think it was anything darker than that. There were moments, looking back now, that should have told me more than I let them. Kimberly worked as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company, a job that kept her traveling 3 or 4 days most weeks, and I remember, in the 2 years before James died, noticing how those trips seemed to multiply. James never complained about it directly, not to me, but there were small things, the way he'd sometimes sit alone at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, working through a crossword puzzle in silence, when Kimberly used to always sit with him on Sundays in the early years. The way, at a family barbecue 18 months before he died, I'd overheard the tail end of a phone call Kimberly took in the backyard, her voice low and clipped, saying something like, "I told you, not right now, I need more time to figure things out," before she noticed me near the door and hung up abruptly with a bright, unconvincing smile. I asked James about it once, gently, the way a mother learns to ask things without pushing too hard. He'd waved it off. "Work stuff, Mom. You know how her job gets." I believed him, or maybe I simply wanted to believe him, because the alternative, that my son's marriage was quietly cracking apart somewhere I couldn't see, felt like more than I wanted to carry on top of everything else. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until months after his funeral, was that James had been carrying that weight almost entirely alone, quietly making arrangements to protect the 2 things he cared about most, his mother, and whatever version of his marriage might still be salvageable, without ever burdening either of us with the full truth of what he suspected. James died 11 months ago. A sudden cardiac event at his desk at work, the kind doctors describe as structurally undetectable until it happens, the kind that takes a healthy 44-year-old man in the space of a single afternoon and leaves everyone around him standing in a hospital corridor unable to fully process what they've just been told. I remember the drive to the hospital more clearly than almost anything else in my life, the traffic light on Route 9 that seemed to take an eternity to turn green, the receptionist's face when I gave my name, the particular quality of silence in a hallway when a doctor is walking toward you slower than you need them to. I buried my only child on a cold Tuesday in November. Kimberly stood beside me at the graveside in a black coat I'd never seen before, holding my arm the way a daughter might hold her mother's, and for those first few days afterward, we leaned on each other in a way that felt, for the first time in years, like something close to real family. I remember thinking, in the fog of that grief, that perhaps this terrible loss had at least brought us closer, that whatever distance had always sat between us might finally begin to soften now that we were the only 2 people left who had loved James most in the world. I was wrong about that too. And 11 days later, I found 4 boxes waiting for me on the porch of the house I believed, with a lawyer's signature behind it, I had every legal right to keep living in. If you're the kind of person who would have suspected something the moment Kimberly's grief felt too tidy, tell me in the comments what tipped you off. For me, it took a stack of boxes to finally see what had been building for months without my noticing. I spent the first 3 nights after being put out of the house on Birchwood Lane in a motel off the highway, the kind with a flickering vacancy sign and a mattress that dipped in the middle, because I hadn't yet processed enough to think clearly about what to do next. Grief has a way of making even simple decisions feel impossible, and I was carrying 2 griefs at once, my son, and now the sudden, disorienting loss of the only home I had left that still smelled like him. I remember unpacking one of those boxes that first night, needing to see something familiar, and finding, tucked between 2 folded sweaters, a photograph I hadn't realized Kimberly had packed, James at maybe 6 years old, gap-toothed, holding up a fish he'd caught at his grandfather's lake house, grinning the exact same grin he still had at 44. I sat on that dipped motel mattress and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry even at the funeral, because grief in public has a shape you can control, and grief alone in a motel room at 11 at night does not. On the 4th day, I called James's oldest friend, a man named Douglas Renner who had been best man at his wedding and who worked, as it happened, as a paralegal at a small estate law firm 2 counties over. I hadn't spoken to Douglas much since the funeral, but he answered on the 2nd ring, and when I told him what had happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Margaret," he said finally, "did Kimberly say anything to you about the will? About probate, about a reading, anything?" I told him no. Nothing. Kimberly had handled everything since James died, the funeral arrangements, the paperwork, the calls to the bank, and I had let her, because grief makes you grateful for anyone willing to carry a burden you don't have the strength to lift yourself. It hadn't occurred to me, in the fog of those first weeks, to ask what exactly she was carrying, or whether she was carrying all of it honestly. "That's strange," Douglas said carefully. "James and I talked about his estate plan a few years back, right after the 2 of you set up that life estate arrangement. He was proud of it. He told me specifically he wanted you protected no matter what happened between him and Kimberly, because," he stopped himself. "Because what, Douglas?" There was another pause. "Because things weren't always smooth between them, Margaret. I don't think it's my place to say more than that. But I know for a fact he had an updated will filed with an attorney in the city, not just the older version from when they first bought the house. If Kimberly hasn't mentioned a reading or filed for probate yet, something isn't right." I asked Douglas, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, whether he thought James had known his marriage was in real trouble. Douglas was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "I think he loved her, Margaret. I also think he wasn't naive. Those 2 things can be true at the same time in a person, especially someone as private as James was about his own worries." He paused, then added something that has stayed with me since. He asked me once, maybe 2 years ago, whether I thought it was possible to love someone and still need to protect yourself from them at the same time. I didn't have a good answer for him then. I'm not sure I have one now either. I sat on the edge of that motel bed with the phone pressed to my ear and felt something shift inside me, the same cold, clear feeling I imagine surgeons must feel the moment before they make the first incision, not panic, but focus. The next morning, before calling anyone else, I drove back past the house on Birchwood Lane, not intending to stop, just needing to see it. Kimberly's car wasn't in the driveway. A cleaning service van was parked out front instead, 2 women carrying bags of what looked like more of my belongings out to a dumpster the neighbors had rented for some unrelated renovation 3 doors down. I didn't stop the car. I didn't confront anyone. I drove past slowly, memorizing the scene the way I imagine a detective might, and then I went back to the motel and called Douglas again. "Douglas," I said. "I need your help finding that will. If you were sitting in that motel room with me, would you have confronted Kimberly directly, or started digging quietly the way I did? Tell me below, I want to know how you'd have handled it." Douglas gave me a name, Priya Kapoor, an estate attorney with an office on Meridian Street whom James had apparently consulted 18 months before his death. I called her office the next morning, my hands trembling slightly as I dialed, unsure whether an attorney would even speak with me, a client's mother rather than the client herself. Priya took my call within the hour. When I explained who I was and what had happened, her voice changed almost immediately, the polite professional caution of someone unsure what a call means shifting into something sharper. more alert. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "I do have James Hale's file. He came to me 18 months ago to update his estate plan. I can't discuss the specific contents with you over the phone without proper documentation confirming your standing, but I can tell you this much: his file has not been closed, and to my knowledge, no probate petition referencing this office has been filed on his behalf." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," Priya said carefully, "that if someone has filed for probate using a different, older will, one this office didn't draft, then either James executed a second will elsewhere that I'm unaware of, which is possible but would be unusual given our conversations, or someone is presenting an outdated document to the court as though it were his final wishes." I drove to her office that same afternoon, boxes still sitting untouched in the trunk of my car, and sat across from her desk while she pulled James's file. The office itself was smaller than I'd expected, tucked above a bakery on Meridian Street, with the faint smell of cinnamon drifting up through the floorboards even in her conference room, an oddly comforting detail I found myself fixating on while she reviewed the paperwork, needing something ordinary to anchor myself to while my son's private legal history unfolded in front of me for the first time. What she showed me changed everything. James had indeed updated his will 18 months earlier, roughly 6 months after what Priya delicately referred to as a period of significant marital strain that James had disclosed to her during their consultations. She read from her intake notes, her voice careful and measured, describing a man who had sat across from her exactly where I was sitting now, worried less about himself, she said, than about what might happen to his mother if his marriage continued to unravel in ways he couldn't fully predict. The updated will didn't just reaffirm my life estate in the garage apartment. It restructured a significant portion of his estate, including a life insurance policy worth $400,000, splitting it between Kimberly and a trust established in my name, specifically because, in James's own words recorded in Priya's file notes, he wanted to ensure his mother was never financially vulnerable regardless of what happened in his marriage. Priya also showed me a handwritten note James had left with her, tucked into the file, that read simply, "Mom gave up everything to make sure I never had to worry. I'm not going to let anyone make her worry now." I sat in that small conference room above the bakery and cried for the first time since the funeral in a way that felt different from grief, something closer to gratitude, mixed with a fresh, sharper kind of anger at everything that had happened in the 11 days since we buried him. I asked Priya the question that had been building in my chest since Douglas's phone call. If this is his real will, why hasn't it been filed? Priya's expression told me she'd already been wondering the same thing. "Mrs. Hale, I think we need to find out exactly what document Kimberly has submitted to the probate court, and how it differs from the one sitting in my file right now. If you're still with me, comment still here so I know this story is landing." Because what Priya and I discovered next would explain not just the boxes on the porch, but 11 months of a grief that had never once felt entirely honest to me. Priya pulled the probate filing from the county court records within a day. Kimberly had submitted a will dated 4 years earlier, the original version James had drafted right after they'd bought the house, before the marital strain Priya had mentioned, before the updated version that protected me. That older will left everything, without qualification, to Kimberly. No mention of a life estate. No mention of a trust in my name. Nothing. "This is the will he replaced," Priya said, laying both documents side by side on her desk. "The question is whether Kimberly genuinely doesn't know the updated version exists, or whether she does know, and is deliberately withholding it." I thought about the 11 days between the funeral and the boxes on the porch. 11 days during which Kimberly had access to every drawer, every filing cabinet, every safe deposit box in a house I no longer had a key to. 11 days during which she'd told me, more than once, not to worry about any of the paperwork, that she was handling everything so I wouldn't have to. I remembered, too, a smaller detail from those first foggy days after the funeral, Kimberly mentioning, almost casually over coffee, that she'd found some old files James kept in a lockbox in his office closet, and that she was planning to go through everything carefully once things settled down a bit. At the time, I'd nodded along gratefully, relieved someone else was willing to handle something I didn't have the strength for. Looking back now, I wonder whether that lockbox was exactly where the updated will's copy, or some reference to it, had been sitting the entire time. Priya explained to me, patiently, how probate timelines typically work, walking me through the paperwork the way a doctor might walk a frightened patient through an unfamiliar diagnosis, breaking it into pieces small enough to hold on to. Kimberly, as the surviving spouse, had moved quickly to file the older will just 8 days after the funeral, 3 days before the boxes appeared on my porch, a timeline Priya found significant. Most grieving spouses don't move that fast, she told me. It usually takes people weeks, sometimes months, before they're ready to sit down with an attorney and start the formal process. 8 days is fast. Fast enough to make me wonder what she was trying to get ahead of. I thought, too, about something I'd noticed at the funeral itself, a detail I'd brushed past in my grief at the time, a man in a gray suit who'd approached Kimberly near the reception line, spoken to her briefly and quietly, and left without ever introducing himself to me, James's own mother. I mentioned this to Priya, and her eyebrows rose slightly. "Can you describe him?" she asked. I did, as best I could remember. Priya made a note and said she'd have Walter Grimes, a private investigator she frequently worked with on contested estates, look into whether anyone matching that description had recent contact with Kimberly through professional channels. Walter called 2 days later with an answer that turned my stomach. The man was a divorce attorney, one who specialized, according to his firm's own website, in asset protection during marital dissolution. Walter had found something else too. Buried in public court filings from 10 months before James died, Kimberly had quietly filed for legal separation 11 months before his death, a filing that had been withdrawn just 3 weeks later, right around the same time James's health, according to his own doctor's notes that Priya later subpoenaed, had begun showing early warning signs that he apparently never mentioned to anyone but his physician. Walter spent the better part of a week reconstructing a fuller timeline, and what he found reshaped my understanding of those final 18 months of my son's life almost completely. The separation filing, it turned out, had come shortly after James discovered, through a credit card statement he'd questioned, according to a brief, almost offhand comment he'd made to Douglas over drinks around that time, a pattern of hotel charges in a city 3 hours away where Kimberly frequently traveled for work, charges that didn't line up with any conference or client meeting on her corporate calendar. James, being James, hadn't confronted her loudly. He'd quietly consulted Priya, updated his will to protect me regardless of what happened, and then, according to Douglas, made the decision to try to work things out with Kimberly rather than end the marriage outright, hoping, I think, that whatever had pulled her away might pass. Whatever conversation happened between them during that period, I'll never fully know the shape of it. What I do know is that the separation filing was withdrawn, the marriage continued on its surface exactly as it had before, and 8 months later, James was gone, having spent the final stretch of his life quietly protecting his mother from a situation he may have suspected, on some level, was never fully resolved. I don't know, to this day, whether James knew about that separation filing having been withdrawn simply as a pause rather than a genuine resolution. Priya believes, based on the timeline, that he likely understood more than he let on, and that it was precisely what prompted him to update his will in the first place, quietly protecting me before whatever was happening in his marriage could put my future at risk. I choose to believe that too, because it means my son's last act of care for me happened with his eyes open, not behind his back. What was clear, without question, was this: Kimberly had known about the separation filing, had reconciled with James for reasons that remained murky, had never once mentioned any of this to me during 11 months of what I believed was shared grief, and had, within 11 days of burying her husband, filed an outdated will with the court while quietly evicting the one person most likely to know that a newer version existed. I asked Priya, during one of our meetings that week, whether she thought Kimberly had genuinely not known about the updated will, or whether this was a deliberate concealment from the very beginning. Priya was careful in her answer, as good attorneys are. "I can't speak to what's in someone's heart, Mrs. Hale. But I can tell you that a woman who takes out $90,000 in undisclosed loans and tours a condominium 3 hours away is not a woman who was planning to stay in this marriage much longer, regardless of what happened to James. Whether she knew about the will specifically, I genuinely don't know yet. But I intend to find out. If you were in my position, learning all of this piece by piece, would you have confronted Kimberly the moment you found out, or waited to build an airtight case first? Tell me below. I want to know how you'd have handled discovering this about someone you'd shared a family table with for years." Priya moved quickly once the pattern became clear. She filed a formal objection to the probate petition, citing the existence of a superseding will drafted 18 months earlier and held in her office's files, supported by James's own signature, witness signatures from 2 of Priya's staff members, and dated attorney notes documenting the reasons behind the changes. Walter, meanwhile, kept digging. He found that Kimberly had, in the 10 months before James's death, taken out 2 personal loans against the equity in the Birchwood Lane house, loans James's own bank statements suggested he'd never been informed about, structured through a separate account Kimberly had opened using her maiden name at a credit union across town. Combined, those loans totaled just under $90,000. Walter traced portions of that money to a boutique in the city known for high-end handbags, to a series of payments to the same divorce attorney who'd approached her at the funeral, and to a deposit on a condominium in a resort town 3 hours away, one Kimberly had apparently been quietly touring in the months before James died. I sat in Priya's office looking at bank statements and loan documents that painted a picture I still, even now, find difficult to fully absorb: a woman who had been planning her exit from a marriage for the better part of a year, who had reconciled with my son for reasons that looked, on paper, less like love rekindled and more like a strategic pause, and who had, upon his sudden death, seen an opportunity to skip the messy process of divorce altogether and simply inherit everything outright. Provided the updated will granting me a share never surfaced. Walter's investigation turned up one more detail that, when Priya explained its significance, made the whole picture click into place with an almost audible sound. 6 weeks before James died, Kimberly had scheduled an appointment with a different attorney, not Priya, a general practice lawyer in a strip mall across town who handled wills as a small side practice among mostly unrelated legal work. According to the appointment record Walter obtained, the stated purpose of the visit was review of existing estate documents. No new will had been filed as a result of that meeting, but Priya believed it was likely the moment Kimberly first learned, or confirmed, that an updated will existed somewhere that named a trust in my favor, information she may have stumbled across in James's home office and wanted a second opinion on before deciding what to do. Walter also pulled Kimberly's work travel records for the 6 weeks leading up to James's death, cross-referencing them against her corporate calendar, and found 2 unexplained gaps: days blocked off as client site visits for accounts that, according to her own company's internal records which Walter obtained through a contact there, had no scheduled visits during that window at all. He couldn't determine exactly where she'd gone during those 2 days, and Priya cautioned against reading too much into gaps that might have innocent explanations. But taken alongside everything else, it added one more thread to a pattern that no longer looked like coincidence to either of us. "I want to be careful here," Priya told me, "because a jury or a judge doesn't need to understand her motives to rule on the facts. What matters is this: there is a valid, later executed will that supersedes the one she filed. Whatever her reasons, that document controls the estate, not her intentions." I appreciated Priya's caution, but I confess that some nights, lying awake in the small room I was renting from an old church friend named Ruth, a widow herself who'd taken me in without hesitation the moment she heard what had happened, I thought less about the legal facts and more about my son, sitting at his desk on that final ordinary afternoon, having spent the last year and a half of his life quietly protecting his mother from a truth he may have suspected but never lived to see fully confirmed. Ruth became an unexpected anchor during those weeks. She'd lost her own husband 4 years earlier and had navigated a smaller, gentler version of estate confusion herself, enough to understand exactly what I was carrying even when I didn't have the words for it. Some evenings we'd sit at her kitchen table, much like the one I'd once shared with James, and she'd remind me, gently but firmly, that gathering proof wasn't the same thing as being vengeful. "You're not trying to destroy her, Margaret," she told me once. "You're trying to make sure your son's actual voice gets heard one more time. That's a different thing entirely." We requested a formal will reading, with all interested parties present, scheduled for 3 weeks later. I spent those 3 weeks doing something I hadn't expected grief to allow me to do. I started sleeping through the night again, not because the pain had lessened, but because for the first time since the funeral, I finally understood exactly what had happened to me, and understanding, even painful understanding, is its own kind of relief. If you're the kind of person who needs closure before you can grieve properly, comment below and tell me, has uncovering a hard truth ever helped you heal faster than staying in the dark? The reading took place in a small conference room at Priya's office, 3 weeks after the boxes had appeared on my porch. Kimberly arrived in black, composed, her attorney beside her, clearly expecting a formality, the reading of the will she herself had filed, the will that left her everything. I remember sitting in that conference room beforehand, waiting for her to arrive, feeling a strange mixture of dread and something almost like calm. Priya had prepared me carefully, walking me through exactly how the meeting would unfold, reminding me more than once that my job was simply to be present, to let the documents speak, and not to let 11 months of grief and anger spill out before the facts had fully landed on the record. Priya opened with a simple statement. Before we proceed, I want to note for the record that this office is in possession of a will executed by James Hale 18 months ago, superseding the document filed with the probate court by Mrs. Kimberly Hale. We believe the filed will does not represent Mr. Hale's final testamentary wishes. I watched Kimberly's face in that moment the way you watch weather move across an open field. Confusion first, quick and almost convincing. Then something harder, something that told me, more clearly than any document ever could, that some part of her had known this moment might eventually arrive. That's not possible, she said, her voice climbing slightly. James never mentioned any other attorney. I handled all of his paperwork. You handled quite a lot of his paperwork, Priya said evenly, sliding copies of the 2 personal loans across the table, along with the withdrawn separation filing and a printed itinerary from the resort town condominium tour, dated 9 months before James's death. I'd like to walk everyone through the timeline. She did exactly that, methodically, document by document, date by date, the way a surgeon lays out instruments before beginning a procedure. The loans taken against the house equity, structured through an account under Kimberly's maiden name. The withdrawn separation filing, and the credit card charges James had quietly questioned around the same period. The consultation with the strip mall attorney, 6 weeks before James died, requesting a review of existing estate documents. And finally, the updated will itself, James's own signature clear and steady at the bottom of each page, dated and witnessed 18 months earlier. Kimberly's attorney, to his credit, asked for a brief recess to confer privately with his client. When they returned 20 minutes later, something in the room had shifted. Kimberly no longer looked composed. She looked like a woman who had spent 11 months building a story and had just watched every plank of it get quietly pulled out from underneath her, one document at a time. I loved him, she said quietly, and for the only time in that entire meeting, I believed something she said might have been at least partly true. Things were complicated, but I loved him. Then perhaps, Priya said, not unkindly, you can explain why you evicted his mother 11 days after his funeral, before this reading could take place. Kimberly didn't answer that question directly. She said something instead about needing space to process, about the arrangement with me having always felt temporary in her mind, words that sounded, even as she said them, like a woman reaching for a story rather than remembering one. I sat quietly through all of it, my hands folded in my lap, thinking about my son's steady signature on that document, the last clear proof of exactly what he had wanted, regardless of what anyone standing in that room chose to say about it now. Her attorney requested time to review the superseding will and its supporting documentation before agreeing to anything, which was his right, and which Priya had fully expected. But by the time we left that conference room, everyone present understood exactly what the coming weeks were likely to hold. If you'd been sitting where I was, watching a story 11 months in the making finally come apart across a conference table, would you have felt anger first, or relief? Comment below, I want to know how you'd have carried that moment. Chapter 8, Hale vs. Hale. The case moved to formal probate litigation over the following 4 months. Kimberly's attorney tried several approaches, none of which held up under the weight of what Walter and Priya had assembled. He argued first that the updated will might have been executed under undue influence from Priya's office, a claim that collapsed the moment Priya produced her intake notes, dated 18 months earlier, showing James had come to her independently, referred by his own accountant, with no involvement from me whatsoever, since I hadn't even known the consultation was happening at the time. He argued next that James might have intended to revert to the original will during the period of reconciliation with Kimberly, a claim that fell apart when Priya produced a follow-up email from James, dated just 4 months before his death, confirming that the updated will still reflects exactly what I want, please don't let anyone change that without hearing directly from me. There was a third argument, briefer than the others, that Kimberly's attorney raised almost as an afterthought during a pretrial hearing, that the life estate and trust provisions were unusually generous toward a parent and might reflect James being unduly persuaded by me during a vulnerable period following his stepfather's death. I sat very still in the gallery when I heard that suggestion, because it came closer than anything else in the entire proceeding to making me genuinely angry. Priya, sensing it, simply asked the court to note that the life estate had been established using my own contributed funds toward the home's purchase, a fact documented in the closing paperwork from 8 years earlier, long before any question of undue influence could reasonably apply. The judge dismissed the argument from the bench without requiring further briefing. Finally, Kimberly's attorney suggested that I, at 69, might have misunderstood the nature of the arrangement regarding the life estate and trust, the same tired suggestion I had heard whispered in other forms throughout my life, the idea that an older woman's understanding of her own affairs can't quite be trusted. Priya, once again, didn't raise her voice. "Your Honor," she said, "Mrs. Hale did not simply misunderstand an arrangement. She contributed $140,000 of her own savings toward this family's home. Her son documented, in writing, across multiple sessions with this office, his intent to protect her regardless of what happened in his marriage. And within 11 days of his death, before this will reading could occur, his widow evicted her from the property specifically named in that protection." I testified during the proceedings, something I had dreaded for weeks beforehand, certain my voice would fail me the moment I had to describe standing on that porch with a cracked teacup in my hands. It didn't fail me. I found, once I started speaking, that I had 11 months of clarity behind every word, and the courtroom listened in a stillness I will remember for the rest of my life. The judge's ruling, when it finally came, was thorough and unambiguous. The updated will was confirmed as James's valid final testament. My life estate in the garage apartment was reinstated, along with my portion of the life insurance trust. The court additionally found that Kimberly's handling of the estate, including the withholding of the superseding will and the undisclosed loans against marital property, constituted a breach of her fiduciary duty as the estate's initial administrator, resulting in a further judgment requiring her to personally cover a significant portion of the legal costs incurred in uncovering the truth. I didn't feel triumphant leaving that courtroom. I felt something quieter, something closer to the particular piece of a woman who had simply refused to let her son's real wishes be erased by someone else's convenience. Chapter 9, The House on Birchwood Lane. I moved back into the garage apartment 6 weeks after the ruling. Kimberly had already listed the main house for sale by then, unwilling, she told her attorney, to keep living somewhere that had become a courtroom instead of a home. I didn't argue with her decision. I understood, in a way I hadn't expected to, that some people can only survive the truth by leaving the place where it caught up with them. The first night back in that garage apartment, I sat on the small porch James had helped me set up years earlier, a single wicker chair and a little table where I used to keep my morning coffee, and I let myself cry in a way I hadn't allowed since the motel room with the fish photograph. Not the sharp, disoriented grief of those first weeks, but something slower and cleaner, the grief of finally being allowed to simply miss my son, without the noise of betrayal crowding out the space where that missing needed to live. The new owners of the main house, a young couple with 2 small children, have been kind neighbors these past several months. The little girl, 5 years old, likes to stand at the fence some afternoons and ask me questions about my garden, the same way I imagine James once stood at fences as a boy, curious about everything, gentle with everyone he met. Her mother, a warm woman named Teresa, brought me a casserole the week I moved back in, not knowing the full story behind the garage apartment, just sensing, the way kind neighbors sometimes do, that I might need it. I told her, eventually, a little of what had happened, and she cried almost as hard as I had, which surprised me, until she told me her own grandmother had gone through something painfully similar decades earlier, with no lawyer, no Priya, no Walter, nothing but silence and a lifetime of quiet resentment that never got the chance to resolve the way mine finally had. With the portion of the trust that came to me, I did something I hadn't expected to do at 69 years old. I sat down with Priya and Douglas and Walter, the 3 people who had helped me find my son's true wishes when everyone else in my life had either abandoned me or actively worked to bury them, and I started something small. We called it the Hale Family Advocacy Fund, a modest nonprofit that connects widowed and elderly parents with pro bono estate attorneys the moment a family member dies, specifically to help people locate and verify a loved one's actual final wishes before anyone else has the chance to quietly file an older, more convenient version. We've helped 11 families so far in our first year. 11 mothers and fathers who might otherwise have found boxes waiting for them on a porch somewhere, the way I did, without ever knowing their child had tried, in whatever quiet way they could manage, to protect them until the very end. One of those families was a father in his 70s whose stepson had tried something almost identical to what Kimberly attempted, filing an outdated will within days of the funeral, and thanks to Priya's quick involvement, we were able to locate the updated version before the estate had fully closed, sparing that family months of the ordeal I went through myself. Another was a woman just a few years younger than me, whose daughter-in-law had convinced her to sign what she believed was a simple power of attorney form, only for it to surface later as something far broader. We caught that one early enough that the damage was minimal, and I still remember the way she gripped my hand afterward, thanking me for something I didn't fully feel I deserved credit for, since all I'd really done was point her toward people smarter and more thorough than I could ever be on my own. Douglas still calls me every few weeks, just to check in, the way James used to. Ruth, my friend who took me in during those first uncertain weeks, has become something closer to family than I ever expected a neighbor could be, and we have dinner together most Thursdays now, the way I once had Sunday dinners with James. She still keeps a spare key to her house on the same hook by her back door where she hung one for me the very first week, just in case. She told me once, everybody should have somewhere they know they can knock without calling first. Walter, gruff and thorough as ever, still occasionally sends me updates on cases he thinks the foundation might be able to help with, always ending his emails the same understated way, "Thought you'd want to know. Hope you're doing all right, Margaret." I think about Kimberly sometimes, though less than I expected I would. I heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that she moved to that resort town eventually, the same one she'd been quietly touring in the months before James died. I don't wish her particular misery, though I won't pretend the anger has entirely faded either. What I've settled into, instead, is something closer to clarity, an understanding that whatever she was chasing in those final months of my son's life, it clearly wasn't the quiet, steady kind of devotion he offered her every single day he was alive. Some nights, sitting on the small porch of the garage apartment James once promised would always be mine, I think about that final email he sent Priya, 4 months before he died. "Please don't let anyone change that without hearing directly from me." I never got to hear it directly from him. But I heard it, eventually, in the only way that mattered, through the plain, unshakable fact of his own signature, on a document that outlived every attempt to erase it. When I meet with families through the foundation now, mothers and fathers sitting across from me the way I once sat across from Priya's desk for the first time, frightened and disoriented and unsure whether what they were feeling was grief or suspicion or both tangled together, I always tell them the same thing first. Grief will try to convince you that asking questions is a betrayal of the person you lost. It isn't. Asking questions, especially hard ones, especially ones that make everyone around you uncomfortable, is very often the last act of love you have left to offer someone who can no longer speak for themselves. I tell them, too, about the boxes on my porch, because I think it matters for people to understand that the worst moments don't always announce themselves with shouting. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in cardboard, on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by someone wearing your loved one's old flannel shirt like a costume they never earned the right to wear. I also tell them something Priya said to me once, near the very end of the litigation, that I've carried with me ever since. She said that in her 15 years handling contested estates, the cases that broke her heart the most weren't the ones involving the largest sums of money, but the ones where a family member simply gave up too soon, assuming that grief alone entitled someone else to walk away with the truth uncontested. The people who fight for the real story, she told me, aren't fighting for money most of the time. They're fighting to make sure the person they lost still gets the final word. That's the thing I hold on to most now, sitting in that garden most mornings with a cup of coffee, watching the little girl next door chase something invisible across the lawn the way children do. James got the final word, eventually. It just took 11 months, a motel room, a cracked teacup, and 3 people willing to help me look until we found it. And I tell them what I've come to believe most firmly of all, the thing that got me through those 11 days between the funeral and the boxes, and the 11 months between the boxes and the ruling that finally set things right. The truth doesn't need you to be loud to survive. It only needs you to keep looking, one document at a time, one phone call at a time, until it can no longer be talked around by anyone standing in its way. If you've ever had someone try to quietly rewrite what a person you loved actually wanted, I want to hear about it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you believe, like I do, that the truth always finds its way home eventually, Even when someone tries to leave it in a stack of boxes on a porch, hit like, subscribe, and stay close. Next time, I'll tell you about another mother who almost lost everything to someone smiling right across her own family table.